Hello. Thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing? The U.S. just abandoned Ukraine. What happens now? I saw this and I had to react to it. I do see it's a little bit controversial, as this topic always will be. It always will be. In fact, I'm going to apologize up front. I'm not an expert on this topic. All I can say is I think it's genuinely sad. I'm sure I'll say a lot more than that, but, I'm not an expert, and anything I say or opinions, I try not to be very political. It just comes from my heart. With that said, hopefully the information in here is accurate. Sometimes when there's a lot of thumbs down, it's inaccurate, but I don't know. You never know anymore. How can anyone know? How does anybody know anything that's actually going on anymore? We all rely on these things on our screens to tell us what's going on. What's going on in Ukraine? I have no idea because I live in America, but my screen will tell me. That was a really weird tangent, but anyway. The infographics show. They're legends. Check them out, link down below. Typically, I wait a long time until I react to videos, but this one's very pertinent to right now. You know what I mean? So I'm reacting to it now. But go check out the infographics show. A small and up-and-coming YouTube channel. Maybe you can be their 15 millionth subscriber. Let's go.
All it took was 10 minutes for the idea of peace in Europe to be hanging by a thread. What should have been a diplomatic meeting instead sent shockwaves around the globe, making it seem inevitable that the U.S. will withdraw aid from Ukraine. But what happens next?
Okay, I cannot help but feel like these images are partly why this video has thumbs down. It's like a baby face. It kind of definitely makes it feel like they're making light of a profoundly serious situation. I'm just saying maybe that's what's got some critical reviews on this video. Anyway, let's move on.
The U.S. will withdraw aid from Ukraine. But what happens next? Will the United States step away from its allies? And if it does, what will that mean?
Will the allies step away from us is the question, I think. Maybe, I don't know.
For Ukraine, Europe, and the future of global stability. The most immediate crisis Europe now faces is the geopolitical fallout from America's withdrawal from Ukraine. In early February 2025, Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei warned the world that the U.S. and the West cannot be trusted to keep their promises, pointing directly to Ukraine's abandonment as proof. This is already undermining a careful network of partnerships and cooperation agreements between the U.S., NATO, and global alliances. It raises serious doubts among nations that once relied on American security guarantees. Now, many are asking themselves, can they really count on the U.S. anymore?
God, this actually sends me into a little bit of an existential crisis mode. I'm not gonna lie. I hope it all turns out okay. And honestly, I don't really feel any kind of panic about global political events typically, because it's like, what can I can't do much about it. And it's just like, wow. I mean, I can vote, and I do vote. Anyway. But this is like, Trump, are you sure about this? Have you thought this through? The implications of what you're doing and how it might impact our alliances and our position in the world as a global superpower. And the USD is the reserve currency of the world. Have you thought about? I don't know. Have you? I hope so.
This uncertainty opens the door for China and Russia to expand their influence, drawing
That's great.
more nations into their orbit. Instead of creating stability, America's withdrawal may actually increase the chances of a global conflict. But for Europe, the real danger isn't just shifting alliances. It's what the White House just did to nuclear non-proliferation.
Sorry, I need to relax.
Or to put it more bluntly, the United States just gave the entire world a reason to build more nuclear weapons. It's well known by now that after the fall of the Soviet Union, a large number of nuclear weapons fell into Ukrainian hands. If they had kept those weapons, they would have been one of the world's major nuclear powers. But under intense American and Western pressure, they agreed to give up those weapons in exchange for guarantees that their sovereignty wouldn't be violated. Since then, it has become abundantly clear this was a mistake. Europe's nuclear headache, courtesy of the White House, is that states which have either nuclear weapons or ambitions for nuclear weapons, nations like
man, wow, yeah, that's a good point. That is a good point. Every nation right now is going to be thinking twice about disarmament and about ramping up their nuclear programs.
North Korea and Iran now have zero incentives to give up their nuclear weapons programs. America can no longer be trusted to keep its commitments. And these nations have seen how readily the new America allows even democratic nations to be swallowed up by their aggressive neighbors. Likewise, nations with no nuclear weapons programs are now seriously considering the need to acquire weapons of their own. Nations such as Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Japan have expressed interest in nuclear weapons to one degree or another, but until recently had American security guarantees to fall back on. It was the Great Exchange to limit nuclear proliferation and reduce the risk of nuclear war. The U.S. positioned itself as the ultimate security guarantor, offering ironclad assurances to its allies. Yet, just 45 days into the new administration, the U.S. abandoned its commitments, proving just how quickly those guarantees can disappear. This creates a big problem for countries like Saudi Arabia and Japan, who face regional powers that either have nuclear weapons or actively want to acquire them. At the moment, Japan is a firm ally of the U.S., but there's no guarantee that the new administration will not change its mind on this nearly century-long alliance when it's no longer convenient for the White House. Even worse, the White House's willingness to
Holy shit.
court and even side with aggressive dictators who invade their neighbors sends a chilling message to U.S. allies.
Okay, I did not know this video would be so critical. I'm enjoying it, but that also leads me to believe I see why it's got so many thumbs down, you know, because once you make a video that is this critical, you're going to have people on the other side that are like, we got to thumb it down. This page has been telling us for the past 4 years that Ukraine was winning the war. Okay.
For Japan, the implications are especially dire. With China's growing imperial ambitions and its push to dominate the Pacific, Japan now faces the terrifying prospect of standing alone against a rising superpower. For Europe, the risk of nuclear proliferation has just magnified overnight. But closer...
Is Japan in NATO? It is not.
to home, a more immediate...
I would have thought it was, to be honest. Are there any non-European countries in NATO? Australia, right? Is Australia in NATO? I guess it's all just European. I honestly didn't know that. Okay. Europe and America. Okay. I would have thought Australia and Japan, but okay.
Question looms. Can they really hold off Russian forces in Ukraine without U.S. support? Trump claims that the U.S. has given $350
I guess that's a good time to say I'm not a history expert at all. I'm not trying to pretend to be at all.
billion in aid to Ukraine, but the numbers don't add up. The State Department itself says that the U.S. has given $182.8 billion. However, independent sources such as the Kiel Institute place the figure of actual military hardware and military financial assistance closer to $119.7 billion.
Well, if we're only counting military, then that's a way different number. I'm just saying that. I don't know why they said that, because that's a way different number. You have to count humanitarian aid, and then you probably have to count refugee expenses, all sorts of stuff. Anyway.
$182 billion figure is inflated by the budget appropriated for training missions for U.S. personnel in Europe, and the vast majority of the real figure is simply the value of the equipment sent to Ukraine, with the U.S. buying modern replacements. It was also claimed that the U.S. had spent more than $300 billion, while Europe spent a third of that. Europe is actually the majority donor of aid to Ukraine, with about $138.7 billion spent in Ukraine, beating the U.S. by $20 billion. Europe's first move after...
I feel like all that is just like, I don't know. There's a lot of nuance to it, and it's been so politicized that it's not even interesting to talk about, to be honest. Like, on video, I don't like it, you know. I just get a lot of comments that are like, nah. But it's like, I mean, I trust that one website, you know, the Kiel Institute that he referenced. And the fact of the matter is that a lot of the money from Europe is indeed in the form of loans. Now, who pays back the loans? Maybe Russia, maybe Ukraine, you know, who knows? That part of the deal isn't figured out yet. But, whereas almost none of the money from America is in the form of a loan. So that's an interesting distinction. Now, he said this was only counting military stuff. I think this is counting more than just military, like also humanitarian aid. But I don't know. Oh, here we go. Yeah, this is counting humanitarian aid, financial aid, military. Now, when Trump talks about it, he might, you know, a lot of politicians try to lie, especially, let's be honest, especially Trump tries to twist the facts. And so he might say, oh, the EU has only sent half as much money, when it's like, okay, in reality, that's the EU Commission. But the EU countries, you add them up and they've sent a lot of money. Anyway, it's not even really honestly fun to talk about. It just feels like so much people. I would rather just say, go here and look for yourself. This, I think, is an accurate source, hopefully. Kiel Institute. Great information.
After the White House meeting was to send President Zelensky a steady stream of support via social media and traditional media. These, however, have a very thoughts and prayers vibe to them, unless Europe gets serious about Ukraine aid. The question is, can Europe get serious? And just how much can it do if it does? In early March 2025, European leaders gathered in London for a summit to decide their next steps. The likely focus was either finding a way to appease the US or at least securing new security guarantees in case of a ceasefire. But even before the issue of military aid comes into play, Europe is already scrambling for solutions, trying to prevent an even greater disaster from unfolding. Much has been said about Ukraine's inability to push Russia out of occupied territories and Russia's constant battlefield gains. However, when put into perspective, Russia is burning through.
I can't help but say, because I'm just thinking about the numbers, and I believe the portion of European money that was in the form of a loan was about 30%, whereas the United States was about like 1% or something, like very low. So it's not, I'm not saying the majority of EU money is a loan, just so you know. Unlike Trump, who did try to say that like all the money was a loan. That's a lie. Everybody lies.
As many as over 2,000 casualties a day to gain hundreds of meters at a time. To make matters worse, the Russian economy is in meltdown and only being propped up by mobilization for war. But a war economy is a dead-end economy, and it can only keep a nation afloat temporarily. That's because, unlike a traditional economy, a war economy focuses on producing single-use items that don't create further value. Instead of producing consumer goods for export, Russian factories churn out tanks, machines that roll onto the battlefield only to be destroyed.
I mean, do you even have to, wonder why a war economy is not sustainable? It's literally war. It's making a bunch of shit to just go destroy it all. It's like literally lighting money on fire and human lives. It's about the stupidest thing in the world.
All the capital and
it's not sustainable. Unless you're a part of the military industrial complex, then it's very good and sustainable for you.
Labor wrapped up in creating said tank is ultimately wasted. This is why many have warned that the Russian economy is increasingly on the verge of absolute disaster. It's also why Putin is actually incentivized to continue fighting until he accomplishes one of two things. Either take enough of Ukraine to plunder it economically, or fight it long enough to score some economic concessions, such as the lifting of sanctions. Either condition will cushion the inevitable economic crash that'll come the day Russian guns stop firing. Given Russia's incredibly precarious situation, it begs the question why the White House would suddenly seemingly make every effort to help them avoid the same collapse that led to the end of the Cold War. And for Europe, it creates a nightmare security scenario as Russia is rewarded for its aggression and cushioned from the worst consequences of its 3-year invasion. The cold hard reality is that without the United States military, Europe is unlikely to be able to deter a fully mobilized Russian military from further aggression. Per one estimate, the EU would need an additional 300,000 troops and over $200 billion in spending just to keep Russia in check if the US were to fully pull out of Europe. The problem.
I don't know, and I would never want to see it happen or whatever, obviously. But that is hard to believe that if there was actual imminent happening threat of Russia invading further into Europe, I think a whole lot of personnel would be signing up would be enlisting. Um, I don't think it would. I don't think Russia would win. I don't know. I don't know.
Problem for Europe in keeping Ukraine in the fight is more of a matter of industry than
And I think they could come up with $200 billion.
money. Together, Europe can more than match the American economy, but what it's seriously lacking is a defense industry. This is a problem shared by all Western nations, including the United States, who after the end of the Cold War shuttered the vast majority of its defense manufacturers as governments turned away from defense spending. Russia's winning hand was to store away massive amounts of weapons it had produced and used during the Cold War, even if it's old. It's hard to argue with the fact that it's kept Russia in a fight where it's experienced catastrophic levels of losses. Europe, however, has never built up the same deep reserves. President Trump isn't wrong when he says that Europe has been too willing to outsource its security to the US, but that's only part of the story. For decades, American policymakers actively encouraged a weaker Europe, one that would remain dependent on US military support. After all, a strong Europe has historically had a bad habit of turning on itself, treating war like a continental pastime. Keeping Europe reliant on the US didn't just prevent internal conflict, it also gave America enormous leverage over its allies.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like, I just don't understand it. I think I've said that like 5 times now, but it's like, what? Doesn't Trump want the U.S. to be the world superpower by far in terms of militarily? Doesn't he want that?
So while Europe bears responsibility
I mean, that's a huge bargaining chip.
for its military weaknesses, the US does too, despite the White House's recent condemnations. It was America who lent its political support to politicians that were against rearmament for decades. At the moment, Europe relies heavily on overseas defense manufacturers, primarily the US, South Korea, Turkey, and Israel. Yet for all 4 countries, defense manufacturers are already facing massive backlogs and waiting lists that are years long for a lot of high-end items such as Patriot air defense batteries. Europe has invested into expanding its defense industry, but this has proven politically difficult and it still isn't enough. The biggest problem to date for Europe and the United States is uncertainty. Defense manufacturers are hesitant to open new plants without assurances of multi-year purchase contracts. That's because it's very expensive to build a new factory, train workers, and source raw materials, a process that can take over a year or more. This massive investment in capital and time means that a defense contractor needs assurances that it will all be worth it.
It is an interesting thing, huh? It's like, I mean, that's kind of the crux of the matter. You're effectively having to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on something you're hoping you never even use. That's unfortunate.
With
It's a hard pill to swallow.
assurances of multi-year spending contracts from governments. This has been difficult to guarantee for a continent where even now defense spending remains unpopular. But the situation is made worse by the fact that even 3 years on, there is no clear goal from
Especially, I mean, it's like there's a meme, you know, this is why we don't have free healthcare here in America. But there's some truth to it. The money goes to the military. So, I mean, obviously, you know, hopefully you can find the money to do both. But at the end of the day, you have to make a budget. At least in theory, you have to make a budget. And if you're having to allocate $100 billion more dollars to defense, it's gonna have to come out of somewhere. And you guys don't want to give up your entitlements, and I don't want you guys to either. So that's a pickle, I feel like, is it not?
from either Europe or America for Ukraine. For years, President Biden carefully avoided saying outright that the goal of U.S. aid to Ukraine was Russia's defeat. Now with President Trump in office, the situation has shifted even further. Europe likewise has followed
I didn't notice that Biden never said it was Russians' defeat was the goal. It's interesting.
suit, with no clear end goal for the conflict from the continent. This means that a defense manufacturer must consider that contracts may come haltingly and end suddenly due to changing political winds, ultimately making expansion of production capabilities an economic loss. This means that Europe has routinely fallen short on promises to Ukraine, such as increasing artillery shell production to 1 million rounds a year as promised in March 2023. It took until only recently for Europe to achieve this goal, and yet this still isn't enough. Russia is estimated to be producing 4.5 million artillery shells a year and has
Wow.
been doing this for the last 2 years. It's bewildering how Russia, a nation with a fraction the economy of either the EU or the US, is so significantly outpacing Western
That is wild.
military production. But it all
wild.
comes down to a perception on the nature of war. And if Europe doesn't change its perception, it's doomed to a future where Russia wins in Ukraine and is posed to strike even
What was that? Captions look like this.
deeper into Europe. Doomed to a future where Russia wins in Ukraine and is posed to strike even deeper into Europe. For Russia, the Ukraine conflict has become an existential one. Losing in Ukraine represents a threat to Vladimir Putin's regime, and thus by proxy to the Russian Federation. Putin is well aware of how the war in Afghanistan directly contributed to the collapse of the USSR, and is wary of how such a similar disaster would spell the end for himself as well. There's already pressure from some Russian territories due to a perceived weakness of the Russian state itself. A loss would prove this weakness to be true, possibly leading to the dissolution of major parts of the Russian Federation.
Oh, that would be crazy.
Russia is fighting for its life, but Europe is fighting for business. Despite the fact that a Russian victory is a threat to European security, few Europeans have seen it as such, at least until the recent actions of the US. For the majority of this war, military support for Ukraine was largely a financial decision, with profit margins of defense contractors to consider. Further complicating Europe's supply efforts to Ukraine is the collective need to replenish and rearm domestic militaries ahead of any aid sent to Ukraine. Europe has already sent massive amounts of equipment to Ukraine, leaving its own stockpiles in need of urgent replenishment. At the time, fear of further Russian aggression has pushed European nations to prioritize their own defense, ramping up military spending and modernization efforts. But with defense manufacturers already stretched thin, most production is now being directed toward
This has been incredibly valuable to me, at least. That's very interesting, hearing about the incentives of and disincentives of the military production in Europe.
building domestic forces, meaning any resupply to Ukraine is now taking a back seat. The White House's recent comments only compounded these fears and made the situation even more difficult. Nations now have had their worst fears confirmed. They will likely have to face further Russian aggression on their own. This has driven up the demand for domestic military expansion even higher, making less room for equipment to resupply to Ukraine. The problem, however, is self-inflicted. Ukraine is fighting today the war that Europe fears it'll have to fight tomorrow. Yet, with Russia's military so severely weakened by the conflict, there's no immediate conventional threat to Europe as long as European nations stand united. Rather than stockpiling weapons for a potential future war, Europe could instead send those arms to Ukraine now, where they're actually needed to fight Russia directly, potentially preventing the very conflict Europe is bracing for. Yet, while it makes perfect sense when seen from a bird's-eye view like this, the political reality is far more complicated. This is where American security guarantees were so important. They allowed European nations to dig deep into their own stocks of equipment, confident that they would be protected if the worst were to come to pass. Yet the current administration's decision to withdraw U.S. protection from Europe has set the stage for geopolitical disaster, one that could lead to Ukraine's defeat and soon after a new war once Russia has had a few short.
Dude, I just won't be able to take that. If after or at some point in the future, in the next, during the Trump administration, Russia invades another country, that will be so crazy. That will officially, I feel like that will officially be World War III. Will it not? And this video's making me feel like it's going to happen. I hope it doesn't. Holy crap.
Years to rebuild its military. Ultimately, the truth is Russia can't stop fighting now. Its economy is entirely too dependent on continued conflict. And now Europe faces two choices: agree to a ceasefire and immediately lift all sanctions, or agree to a ceasefire without lifting of sanctions. It makes sense not to lift the sanctions as a way of punishing Russia for starting the war in the first place. It also sends a strong deterrent message to the rest of the world. However, this also...
Well, and then you can take the frozen funds and use it to pay back the loans. But Russia doesn't want that, do they? Russia probably really does not want that. I don't know if they would agree to that. That'd be interesting, huh?
It means that in order to keep its economy afloat, Russia will need to build more weapons, not stop. Within just the span of a few short years, Russia's military will have swelled to pre-war levels, with manpower boosted thanks to the annexation of Ukraine. From there, it only makes sense to continue the war into the rest of Europe. The second choice, to agree to a ceasefire and lift all sanctions, would cushion the Russian economy and give Putin the option to demobilize without an economic disaster that costs him his presidency. But this sends a message to the world that aggression is rewarded in the modern era. Even worse, it would economically strengthen Russia, so it's in a better position to threaten Europe after a period of rebuilding and integrating Ukraine.
What a freaking disaster, man.
Basically, Europe faces a devil's choice without America, and without some serious changes in policy, it's not set to support Ukraine through to a victory. Can Europe step up and defend Ukraine without US support, or is a Russian victory inevitable? Share your thoughts in the comments.
Oh my god. Who's here to check the comments? Me. In one video we went from, I don't care about his other videos right now. Man, you don't like how... I read Poland is now requiring all males to go through military training. Considering that Ukraine was the only gap between them and Russia, I wonder why that wasn't always the case. What? You wonder why that wasn't always the case? Okay. The biggest mistake one can make is having to rely on somebody else. All right. Thank you for watching. Shout out to Infographics Show. Check them out, link down below. Hope you guys are having a great weekend. I'll see you next week. Bye.